Margaret Sullivan answered a simple newspaper ad for a mail-order bride, expecting to marry a humble shopkeeper in Montana. But the man waiting at the train station wore clothes worth more than her entire Boston tenement building. How did a desperate seamstress become the wife of the territory's wealthiest railroad tycoon, and what shocking deception brought them together? The factory whistle screamed like a dying animal, yanking Margaret Sullivan from dreams of warm bread and her mother's laugh. Her eyes snapped open to frost patterns on the boarding house window, delicate ice flowers that would melt by noon, unlike the permanent chill in her bones. She pushed aside the thin blanket, her breath visible in the morning air, and reached under her mattress for the newspaper clipping that had become more precious than gold. "Mail order bride wanted," she whispered, reading the familiar words again. "Montana territory. Respectable woman for immediate marriage. Room, board, and kind treatment guaranteed." Her roommate Sarah stirred in the other narrow bed, coughing that awful wet sound that meant the cotton fibers were already destroying her lungs. Margaret had counted. Sarah was the third roommate in 2 years to develop that cough. The factory was eating them alive, one breath at a time. Margaret dressed quickly in the dark, her fingers numb as she buttoned her one good dress. Navy wool, mended so many times the original fabric was more memory than reality. The other girls called it her Sunday dress, though she hadn't seen the inside of a church since her parents' funeral. God, it seemed, had better things to do than listen to the prayers of factory girls. The morning routine was automatic now. Splash of icy water on her face, quick braid of her auburn hair, and down the creaking stairs before Mrs. Henderson could demand this week's rent. Margaret had exactly $7 saved, enough for a train ticket west, if she skipped meals for the next 3 days. But first, she had to survive another shift at Morrison's textile mill. The December streets of Boston were rivers of slush and horse manure, the grand buildings of Beacon Hill mocking the hunched figures hurrying to work. Margaret joined the stream of women flowing toward the factory, their faces gray as the dawn sky. Some were mere children, others old before their time, all wearing the same expression of resignation. "You're dreaming again, Maggie," said Alice, falling into step beside her. At 16, Alice was the youngest in their section, but the factory had already stolen the sparkle from her eyes. "I saw you reading that advertisement." "Maybe I am," Margaret admitted, dodging a puddle that would have soaked through her worn boots. "Would that be so terrible?" Alice grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop. "Montana? You might as well say you're going to the moon. At least here you know what to expect." "That's exactly why I need to leave." Margaret pulled free, continuing toward the looming brick building that blocked out the rising sun. "I know what to expect. Another year, maybe 2, before I'm coughing like Sarah. Before my fingers are too twisted to hold a needle." The factory gates swallowed them with a clang that echoed like a prison door. Inside, the air was thick with cotton dust that coated everything: machines, windows, lungs. The noise hit like a physical blow. Hundreds of power looms thundering in endless rhythm, spindles whirring, leather belts slapping against wheels. Margaret took her place at loom number 47, the beast that had claimed 2 of her fingernails last winter. 10 hours stretched ahead, 10 hours of watching threads blur into cloth, of jumping when the overseer's stick cracked against someone's station, of pretending not to notice when another girl fainted from hunger or exhaustion. By the lunch break, her decision was made. The factory's single window offered a view of smoke-stained sky as Margaret composed her reply to the advertisement. Her hands shook slightly. From hunger, exhaustion, or fear, she couldn't tell. The other girls thought she was writing to her fictional cousin in Providence, the one she'd invented to explain her occasional letters. "Dear Mr. Mackenzie," she wrote, the pen scratching against cheap paper. "I am writing in response to your advertisement for a mail-order bride. I am 24 years old, of good character, and experienced in household management." She paused, considering what else to say. Should she mention her education, cut short by her parents' deaths? Her skill with needle and thread? In the end, she kept it simple. Men seeking mail-order brides weren't looking for accomplished women. They wanted someone desperate enough to say yes. "I can be ready to travel within the week. Please advise regarding the arrangements." Sincerely, Miss Margaret Sullivan. The afternoon shift dragged endlessly. Margaret's mind wandered to Montana. Vast skies, clean air, a little house where she could breathe without tasting cotton. Maybe children someday with round cheeks and strong lungs. Even marriage to a stranger seemed preferable to slow death in the mill. The overseer's stick cracked against her loom, jolting her from daydreams. Keep your mind on your work, Sullivan, unless you want your pay docked again. That evening, Margaret mailed her letter at the post office, using coins that should have bought supper. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes, noticed her hesitation. "Important letter?" he asked. "Perhaps the most important of my life," she admitted. Walking back to the boarding house, Margaret felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope, dangerous and delicate as the frost flowers on her window. She'd given herself a chance, however slim, at a different life. Now all she could do was wait. The reply came faster than expected. A telegram delivered just 4 days later. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows shot up as she handed over the yellow envelope, clearly dying to know its contents. Margaret's fingers trembled as she tore it open. Proposal accepted, stop train ticket enclosed, stop expect you December 20th, stop Thomas Mackenzie. Tucked inside was a first-class train ticket to Silver Creek, Montana Territory. First class. Margaret had never even seen a first-class ticket before, let alone held one. The luxury seemed almost obscene, surely a mistake. But the ticket was real, her name printed clearly on the expensive paper. Sarah was awake when Margaret climbed the stairs that night. Her coughing temporarily subsided. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she wheezed, seeing Margaret's face. "I heard Mrs. Henderson talking about a telegram." Margaret sat on Sarah's bed, taking her friend's cold hand. "Come with me. We'll find a way." "No." Sarah's smile was gentle. "This is your chance, Maggie. Take it. Live for both of us." The next week passed in a blur of preparations. Margaret sold everything she couldn't carry, her mother's tea set, her father's watch, even her winter coat. She would need money for the journey, for unexpected expenses. The other factory girls whispered behind their hands, but Margaret didn't care. In a few days, she'd be beyond the reach of their gossip. On her last night in Boston, Margaret sat by the window, watching snow fall on the gaslit street. Tomorrow she would board a train heading west, toward a man she'd never met, a life she couldn't imagine. Terror and excitement warred in her stomach. She touched the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's wedding gift, the one thing she refused to sell. "I'm doing it, Mama," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm taking the chance you never had." As if in answer, the wind rattled the windows, carrying the distant whistle of a train. Somewhere out there, beyond the factories and tenements, beyond everything she'd ever known, a new life waited. All she had to do was find the courage to claim it. Margaret Sullivan, factory girl, would board that train tomorrow. But who would step off in Montana? The question both thrilled and terrified her. She fingered the first-class ticket again, wondering about the man who had sent it. Thomas Mackenzie. Even his name sounded solid, respectable. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Alice stood in the hallway, clutching a small package. "I brought you something," she said, thrusting it forward. "For the journey." Inside was a pair of thick wool stockings and a small jar of preserves. "My mother made the jam," Alice explained. "She says Montana winters are fierce." Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. These girls, who had so little, were giving her pieces of themselves to carry west. She hugged Alice tight, memorizing the moment. That night, Margaret dreamed of endless skies and mountains that touched the clouds. In her dream, a faceless man waited at a train station, holding a sign with her name. But when she tried to approach him, the platform stretched longer and longer, keeping them forever apart. She woke with a start, heart pounding. Through the window, the first hints of dawn painted the sky pink and gold. Today. The word echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. Today everything would change. Margaret dressed carefully in her traveling clothes, the navy dress, freshly pressed, and her mother's cameo. Her single carpetbag held everything she owned. 2 dresses, 3 chemises, stockings, a shawl, her Bible, and the precious jar of preserves. The first-class ticket was tucked safely in her bodice, close to her heart. The walk to the train station felt surreal. Factory girls streamed past her toward the mill, barely glancing at the woman walking against the tide. Did they see anything different about her? Could they tell she was escaping? North Station loomed ahead, its clock tower reaching toward the heavens. Steam from waiting trains mixed with the morning fog, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. Margaret's steps slowed as reality struck. She was really doing this, leaving everything familiar for a promise written in a newspaper. Inside the station, the world transformed. Ladies in fur coats glided past, followed by porters carrying mountains of luggage. Men in silk top hats read newspapers while sipping coffee from china cups. Margaret clutched her single bag tighter, acutely aware of her mended dress and worn boots. "May I help you, miss?" A uniformed conductor appeared at her elbow. Margaret showed him her ticket, half expecting him to laugh or say it was counterfeit. Instead, his demeanor changed instantly. "Right this way, madam. The Western Express departs from platform 3. Shall I take your bag?" "Madam." When was the last time anyone had called her that? The train wheels shrieked against frozen rails as Margaret pressed her forehead to the glass, watching Montana's mountains rise like jagged teeth against the pearl-gray sky. 3 days of travel had transformed her world from Boston's cramped streets to this endless wilderness. Her reflection in the window showed a stranger, eyes wide with wonder and fear, cheeks flushed from the heated car, auburn hair escaping its careful braid. Silver Creek, next stop. The conductor's voice boomed through the first-class car, making her jump. Around her, elegant passengers gathered belongings without hurry. A woman in green velvet caught Margaret staring and smiled kindly. "First time in Montana, dear?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Her stomach churned with questions. What if Thomas Mackenzie took one look at her mended dress and sent her back? What if he was cruel? Old? Drunk? The newspaper advertisement had promised kind treatment, but promises were cheap as winter sunshine. The train slowed, steam hissing like angry snakes. Through the frost-laced window, Silver Creek emerged from the morning mist. A proper town with brick buildings, church spires, and streets lined with wooden sidewalks. Much larger than she'd imagined. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the platform came into view. And there he stood. Margaret's breath caught. The man holding a sign with Miss Sullivan, written in bold letters, was nothing like she'd pictured. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a coat that probably cost more than her yearly wages at the factory. Silver threaded his dark hair at the temples, and even from a distance, his bearing commanded attention. This couldn't be right. This man belonged in Boston's finest drawing rooms, not meeting a mail-order bride in Montana. The train lurched to a stop. Margaret's fingers fumbled with her carpet bag, suddenly aware of every mended seam, every worn spot on her dress. She stepped onto the platform, legs shaking, and the mountain air hit her like a slap, sharp, clean, scented with pine. "Miss Sullivan?" His voice was deep, cultured. Up close, she saw his eyes were the color of storm clouds, intense and searching. "I'm Thomas Mackenzie. There must be some mistake," she blurted, then immediately wished she could swallow the words. His eyebrows rose slightly. "You are Margaret Sullivan from Boston? You answered my advertisement." "Yes, but—" She gestured helplessly at his fine clothes, the obvious wealth in every detail from his gold watch chain to his polished boots. "Your letter said you were a shopkeeper." "I said I lived near the general store." A small smile played at his lips. "Which is entirely true. Shall we?" He offered his arm like a gentleman escorting a lady to the opera. Margaret hesitated, acutely aware of curious stares from other passengers. She was nobody, a factory girl with calloused hands and a single carpet bag. But she'd come too far to retreat now. She took his arm. A gleaming carriage waited beyond the station, pulled by matched black horses that tossed their heads impatiently. The driver tipped his hat as Thomas helped her up, his hand strong and steady at her elbow. The leather seats smelled of money and polish. I trust your journey was comfortable? Thomas asked as they rolled through town. The first-class accommodation was satisfactory? Margaret nearly laughed at the absurdity. Satisfactory? She'd felt like a princess, sleeping in a real bed, eating from china plates. It was more than I expected. Like everything else, it seems. Main Street bustled with morning activity. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks, women in fashionable coats browsed window displays, and men in business suits strode purposefully toward a massive stone building marked Mackenzie Railroad and Mining Company. Thomas followed her gaze. Yes, that's mine too. The carriage turned onto a tree-lined avenue where houses grew progressively grander. Margaret's confusion deepened into something close to panic. This was wrong, all wrong. She should demand to be taken back to the station, should. The carriage stopped before iron gates that swung open silently. Beyond them rose a mansion that belonged in a fairy tale, all towers and gables and windows that caught the morning sun like diamonds. Margaret's mouth went dry. Welcome to Mackenzie House, Thomas said quietly. A uniformed butler opened the carriage door. Margaret stumbled slightly as she stepped down, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her mistake. This wasn't just wealth, this was American aristocracy. Railroad money, mining money, the kind of fortune that built empires. You're not a shopkeeper, she whispered, anger replacing shock. You're not anything like what you claimed in your letters. Thomas dismissed the butler with a nod and turned to face her fully. No, I'm not, and I apologize for the deception. But perhaps we should continue this conversation inside. The entrance hall soared 3 stories high, dominated by a crystal chandelier that scattered rainbow light across marble floors. A sweeping staircase curved upward, and oil paintings in gilt frames lined the walls. Margaret had cleaned houses like this in Boston, through the servants' entrance. Mrs. Winters will show you to your room, Thomas said, gesturing to a stern-faced woman in black bombazine. We'll speak at dinner. I imagine you'd like to rest after your journey. Margaret found her voice. I'd like to speak now, Mr. Mackenzie, about why you felt it necessary to trick a desperate woman into traveling across the country under false pretenses. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise? Respect? Very well. My study, then. The study was all dark wood and leather-bound books, a fire crackling in an enormous hearth. Thomas poured himself a brandy and offered her sherry, which she declined with a sharp shake of her head. I placed that advertisement, he began, because I wanted to find a wife who would see me, not my bank account. Someone who wouldn't be dazzled by. He gestured vaguely at the opulent room. All of this. So you lied. Margaret's fear had crystallized into fury. You took advantage of women with no options. Women desperate enough to marry a stranger, just to play some game? It wasn't a game. His voice hardened. I've been engaged 3 times, Miss Sullivan. Each time to a woman who saw dollar signs instead of a person. Each time ended when they revealed their true nature. One tried to empty my accounts before the wedding. Another was found in a compromising position with my business rival. And the third, he stopped, pain crossing his features. The third attempted to have me declared mentally unfit so she could control my assets. Margaret sank into a leather chair, her anger deflating slightly. But surely there are honest women of your own class. Are there? He laughed bitterly. In my world, marriage is a business merger. Love, companionship, genuine connection. These are fairy tales for the poor. He moved to the window, staring out at the manicured grounds. I wanted something real. Someone who would marry Thomas Mackenzie, not the Copper King of Montana. The title hung in the air between them. Copper King. She'd read about such men in the newspapers, industrial titans who controlled entire territories. And she'd agreed to marry one, thinking he sold dry goods and penny candy. What happens now? She asked quietly. You've seen that I'm exactly what I claimed. A factory girl with nothing to offer someone like you. Thomas turned from the window, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. What I see is a woman brave enough to cross a continent for a chance at a better life. Honest enough to be angry at deception. strong enough to speak her mind to a man who could buy and sell her hometown. He paused. Stay through Christmas. That's all I ask. If you still wish to leave, I'll provide a generous settlement and passage anywhere you choose. And if I stay, then we proceed as planned. A wedding, but only if you're willing. No tricks, no deception. You'll know exactly who you're marrying. Margaret touched her mother's cameo, thinking of the factory, of Sarah's cough, of endless days that ground women into dust. Here was luxury beyond imagining. But at what price? Marriage to a stranger who'd already proven himself capable of elaborate deception? Through Christmas, she agreed finally. But I sleep in a locked room, and you keep your distance. Of course. He inclined his head formally. Mrs. Winters will see to your comfort. Dinner is at 7. We dress for the evening meal. Dress for dinner? Margaret almost laughed. She owned exactly 2 dresses, and he'd already seen the better one. Her room turned out to be a suite larger than her entire Boston boarding house. A canopied bed dominated one wall, while tall windows overlooked gardens dusted with snow. The bathroom, her own private bathroom, featured a massive clawfoot tub and gilt fixtures. Mrs. Winters bustled about, directing maids who unpacked Margaret's pitiful carpetbag. Mr. Mackenzie has instructed me to arrange a wardrobe for you, the housekeeper said, eyeing Margaret's worn dresses with polite distaste. The seamstress will arrive this afternoon for measurements. That won't be necessary, Margaret began, but Mrs. Winters cut her off. Mr. Mackenzie insists. You'll need appropriate attire for the Christmas ball, at the very least. Christmas ball? Margaret sank onto a velvet settee, feeling like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. This morning she'd been a factory girl. Now she was... What? A guest? A potential bride? A charity case? A maid appeared with tea service on a silver tray. Real silver, with delicate china cups painted with roses. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the pot. It was heavier than she expected, and she nearly dropped it. Allow me, miss, the maid said gently, taking over with practiced ease. Shame burned Margaret's cheeks. She didn't belong here, didn't know the rules of this glittering world. What was she thinking, agreeing to stay? Thomas Mackenzie might want a wife who saw beyond his wealth, but how could she ever be comfortable in this palace? The seamstress arrived precisely at 2, armed with fabric samples and fashion plates from Paris. Margaret stood like a mannequin as measurements were taken, overwhelmed by discussions of silk versus satin, bustles versus trains. The emerald velvet, I think, the seamstress declared, to complement your coloring, and the burgundy silk for Christmas dinner. This is too much, Margaret protested. I can't accept. Mr. Mackenzie's orders were quite specific, the woman replied firmly. You're to have everything necessary for your position. Her position. The words echoed as Margaret stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror. What exactly was her position? She wasn't his wife, wasn't even officially his fiancée. She was a guest who might disappear after Christmas, yet he was spending a fortune on gowns she might wear only once. By evening, Margaret's simple navy dress had been whisked away for freshening, and she found herself laced into borrowed silk the color of storm clouds. A maid arranged her hair in elaborate curls, fastening it with pearl-tipped pins that probably cost more than a month's factory wages. The dining room could have seated 50, but only 2 places were set at one end of the massive table. Crystal and silver gleamed in the light of 3 chandeliers. Thomas rose as she entered, approval warming his eyes. You look lovely, Miss Sullivan. Margaret's cheeks heated. She felt like an imposter playing dress-up, certain everyone could see through her disguise. The first course arrived, some sort of clear soup she didn't recognize, and she froze, confronted by an array of silverware that seemed designed for torture rather than eating. Thomas caught her hesitation. Without drawing attention, he selected his own spoon from the outside of the setting, giving her a subtle guide to follow. The gesture was surprisingly kind. Tell me about Boston, he said as they ate. Your life there. There's little to tell. My parents died 3 years ago, scarlet fever. I went to work at Morrison's textile mill to survive. She met his eyes defiantly. I'm not ashamed of it. Nor should you be. Hard work is admirable, regardless of the setting. He paused. What did you dream of before the factory? The question caught her off guard. I wanted to be a teacher. I'd completed normal school, had a position waiting, but... She shrugged. Death has a way of changing plans. They talked through 5 courses, and Margaret found herself relaxing despite the formal setting. Thomas was genuinely interested in her opinions, her experiences. He spoke of building the railroad, of labor disputes he'd settled fairly, of his vision for Montana's future. You're not what I expected, she admitted over dessert. Some French confection she couldn't pronounce but which tasted like clouds and chocolate. Nor are you. His smile was enigmatic. Most women in your position would be calculating how quickly they could secure my fortune. You look ready to bolt at any moment. The thought has crossed my mind, she confessed. This world, it's not mine. I don't know the rules, the expectations. I'm terrified I'll use the wrong fork and scandalize society. Thomas laughed. A rich, genuine sound that transformed his face. Society needs scandalizing now and then. Besides, I didn't advertise for a society wife. I advertised for a partner. After dinner, he showed her the conservatory. A glass palace filled with orange trees and exotic flowers that perfumed the air. Snow fell softly outside, creating a magical contrast with the indoor garden. My mother built this, Thomas said, touching an orchid's delicate petals. She came from humble beginnings too. A miner's daughter who married the man who would become the territory's first millionaire. She never forgot where she came from. Is that why you chose this method? To find someone like her? Perhaps. He turned to face her fully. Or perhaps I'm simply tired of emptiness in a house built for family. Tired of conversations that never venture beyond gossip and fashion. Tired of... He stopped abruptly. Forgive me. I'm being maudlin. Margaret surprised herself by touching his sleeve. It's the most honest you've been since we met. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the air between them charged with possibility. Then Thomas stepped back, the moment broken. It's late. You must be exhausted from your journey. Back in her suite, Margaret unpinned her hair and stared at her reflection. The elegant woman in the mirror bore little resemblance to the factory girl who'd boarded a train in Boston. But underneath the silk and pearls, she was still Margaret Sullivan. Still uncertain, still afraid, still wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A maid entered with a tray of hot chocolate and a folded note. Miss Sullivan. The note read in bold handwriting. Thank you for giving me a chance. T.M. Margaret touched the heavy paper, tracing the words with her fingertip. Thomas Mackenzie was offering her a world beyond her wildest dreams. But at what cost? Could she truly be mistress of this grand house? Wife to one of the territory's most powerful men? Or would she always feel like an interloper, forever looking over her shoulder for the moment when everyone realized she didn't belong? Snow continued falling outside her window, blanketing the gardens in pristine white. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed midnight. She had until Christmas to decide her fate, to choose between the familiar misery of the factory and the terrifying possibility of happiness in this gilded cage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations. But tonight, Margaret Sullivan fell asleep in a feather bed, her dreams filled with orange blossoms and storm-gray eyes, wondering if fairy tales might sometimes come true, even for factory girls brave enough to answer an advertisement in a newspaper. The china plate felt heavier than a week's worth of laundry in Margaret's hands. She'd never eaten off anything so fine. Back in Boston, they used tin plates that clanked against wooden tables. Now she sat in a dining room bigger than her entire boarding house, while servants in crisp uniforms moved silently around her like ghosts. You haven't touched your food, Thomas said, his voice carrying across the long table. He sat at the far end, looking more like a king than a man who'd written those simple letters about wanting a companion. Margaret forced herself to take a bite of the fancy meat on her plate. It melted in her mouth, nothing like the tough scraps she'd boiled back home. It's very good, she managed. though her stomach churned with questions. Thomas set down his fork with a soft clink that seemed to echo. You want to know why I lied? It wasn't a question. Margaret met his eyes, surprised by the sadness she saw there. This wasn't the look of a man who enjoyed tricking people. I own half this town, Thomas continued, gesturing to the windows where gas lamps lit the snowy streets. The railroad brings everything in and out. The mines produce more silver than anywhere else in Montana. And yet, he paused, running a hand through his graying hair. I couldn't find a single person who wanted to know me, not my money. Margaret remembered counting pennies for bread, walking past shop windows full of things she could never afford. So you pretended to be poor? Not poor, just ordinary. Thomas stood and walked to the fireplace, where flames danced behind an iron grate. 3 women agreed to marry me before. The first one emptied my safe and ran off with my accountant. The second tried to poison me for the inheritance. Margaret's fork clattered to her plate. Poison. A bitter smile crossed his face. The cook caught her putting something in my coffee. The third. He shook his head. She was honest about it, at least. Said she'd rather die than wake up next to my face every morning. But my money made it bearable. Outside, wind rattled the windows, and Margaret pulled her shawl tighter. She thought of the letter she'd answered, the careful handwriting that spoke of simple dreams. Why me? There must have been others who answered your advertisement. Thomas returned to his chair, but this time he sat closer to her. You were the only one who asked about the town, not the house. You wanted to know if there was a library, not how many servants I kept. His eyes softened. You signed your letter hoping to build a life, not find a fortune. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. She had written those words, sitting by candlelight in her cold room, dreaming of something more than survival. I meant them. I know. Thomas reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. That's why I chose you. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. Margaret stared at his hand. Rough and scarred, not the soft hands she'd expected from a rich man. Those aren't the hands of someone who sits behind a desk all day. Thomas turned his palm up, revealing calluses and old burns. I started in the mines when I was 14, worked my way up loading coal, laying track, fixing engines. He flexed his fingers. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't erase the past. Margaret thought of her own hands, pricked by countless needles, roughened by lye soap. And now I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. His voice dropped. And no one to share it with who sees anything but dollar signs when they look at me. A servant appeared to clear their plates, but Thomas waved him away. The man disappeared as silently as he'd come, leaving them alone with the crackling fire and the weight of truth between them. You could have told me, Margaret said softly. In your letters. Would you have come? Thomas asked. If you knew the Copper King of Montana was waiting at the station instead of a simple shopkeeper? Margaret considered this. Would she have boarded that train, knowing the truth? The thought of such wealth would have terrified her more than the journey itself. Probably not, she admitted. Then I'm glad I didn't tell you. Thomas stood again, moving to a cabinet near the wall. He returned with a wooden box, simple and worn. This was my mother's. Inside lay a plain gold ring, nothing like the elaborate jewels Margaret had imagined rich women wore. She was a washerwoman, Thomas explained. Died when I was 16. This ring and her Bible were all she left me. Margaret touched the ring gently. It was warm, as if it still held the heat of its last wearer. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to understand. Thomas closed the box. I didn't bring you here to be a decoration or a trophy. I brought you here because your letters showed me someone who values the same things my mother did. Hard work, honesty, kindness. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime, marking 9 o'clock. Margaret realized she'd been in this house for hours but had seen only a fraction of it. What happens now? Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered town. Stay until Christmas. 3 weeks. Get to know the real me, not the Copper King everyone else sees. He turned back to her. If you still want to leave after that, I'll buy you a ticket to anywhere you want to go. First class. With enough money to start fresh. Margaret stood, her legs shaky after sitting so long. She joined him at the window, looking down at Silver Creek. Horse-drawn carriages moved through the streets, their lanterns like fireflies in the dark. Somewhere out there, a train whistle blew, the same sound that had carried her hopes across the country. "And if I stay?" she asked. Thomas's reflection in the glass smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Then we get married like we planned. Only this time you'll know exactly who you're marrying." Margaret thought of her empty room in Boston, the factory whistle that ruled her days, the hollow feeling of going to bed hungry. Then she looked around this warm room, at the man who'd worked his way up from nothing, who kept his mother's ring in a simple wooden box. 3 weeks, she agreed. Thomas nodded, relief plain on his face. "I'll have Mrs. Henderson show you to your room. It's late, and you must be tired from your journey." As if summoned by magic, an older woman appeared in the doorway. Her kind face reminded Margaret of her own mother, dead these 3 years from consumption. "This way, miss," Mrs. Henderson said, picking up Margaret's small bag as if it weighed nothing. Margaret followed, but paused at the doorway. "Thomas!" He turned, and in that moment, she saw not the wealthy mine owner or the railroad baron, but the boy who'd lost his mother, who'd built an empire but couldn't buy what he truly wanted. "Thank you for dinner," she said simply. The smile he gave her warmed her more than the fireplace had. "Breakfast is at 7. I'll show you the town afterward, if you'd like." Margaret nodded and followed Mrs. Henderson up a staircase wide enough for 3 people to walk side by side. Paintings of landscapes lined the walls, and carpet soft as clouds cushioned her steps. Everything spoke of wealth beyond her imagination. Yet all she could think about was that simple gold ring and the calluses on Thomas's hands. The bedroom Mrs. Henderson led her to was bigger than her entire Boston apartment. A fire already crackled in the hearth, and the bed looked like it could sleep a family of 5. "If you need anything, just ring this bell," Mrs. Henderson said, pointing to a silk cord by the bed. "Kitchen's always got something warm, even at midnight." After the housekeeper left, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat. She pulled out the letter that had brought her here, worn from reading, creased from traveling. The careful handwriting hadn't changed, but now she saw what she'd missed before. The paper was too fine, the ink too good for a simple shopkeeper. She'd been so desperate to leave Boston, so eager to believe in a fresh start, that she'd ignored the signs. Or maybe she'd seen only what she wanted to see. A knock at the door made her jump. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Henderson. Instead, Thomas stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. "I forgot to give you this," he said, holding out another wooden box. "It's not. I mean, you don't have to." Margaret took the box, touched by his awkwardness. Inside lay a silver brush and mirror set, engraved with roses. "They were supposed to be a wedding gift," Thomas explained. "I bought them before you arrived. You should have them now, whether you stay or not." The silver felt cool in her hands, heavier than anything she'd ever owned. "I don't know what to say." "Say good night," Thomas suggested. "Everything else can wait until morning." After he left, Margaret unpacked her few belongings. Her spare dress looked shabby hanging in the massive wardrobe. Her mother's old Bible seemed small on the bedside table. But when she finally lay down in the enormous bed, pulling quilts that felt like clouds around her, she realized something. For the first time since her parents died, she felt safe. Not because of the locks on the doors or the servants downstairs, but because Thomas Mackenzie, the Copper King of Montana, had calluses on his hands and kept his mother's ring in a simple wooden box. 3 weeks, she thought, as sleep claimed her. 3 weeks to learn the truth behind the title. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the town in white, hiding the muddy streets and smoke-stained buildings. Like Thomas himself, Silver Creek had layers that would take time to uncover. And Margaret Sullivan, former seamstress from Boston, had 3 weeks to decide if she wanted to dig beneath the surface or take the first train back to everything she knew. The choice, like the snow, would wait until morning. Behind the general store's dusty window, a woman in black watched Margaret pass by for the 3rd time that morning. The December air bit through Margaret's wool coat. One of several Thomas had insisted she borrow from storage, but she hardly noticed. Her mind buzzed with yesterday's tour of Silver Creek, where every other building seemed to bear the Mackenzie name. "Lost, dear?" The woman's voice cut through the morning quiet like shattered glass. She stood in the store's doorway now, her morning dress rustling like dead leaves. Margaret stopped, grateful for any interruption to her confused thoughts. "Just exploring, ma'am." "Ma'am." The woman's laugh had edges sharp enough to cut. "How quaint. I'm Eleanor Hartley, and you must be Thomas's latest investment." The word hung in the cold air. Margaret straightened her spine, a habit from years of facing Boston's society ladies while delivering their dresses. Margaret Sullivan, his fiancée. Eleanor's painted lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Of course you are. Come inside, dear. The wind's picking up, and we wouldn't want you catching your death." She paused, eyes glittering. "Not yet, anyway." The store's warmth hit Margaret like a wall. Familiar smells of coffee beans and leather mixed with Eleanor's heavy perfume, creating an atmosphere thick enough to choke on. Barrels of flour and sugar lined the walls, while glass jars of candy caught the lamplight. "Tea." Eleanor moved behind the counter with practiced grace. Without waiting for an answer, she poured 2 cups from a pot that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Margaret accepted the delicate china cup, noting how out of place it looked among the store's practical goods. "You know Thomas well?" "Better than most." Eleanor's rings clinked against her cup. "My sister was his first wife." The tea suddenly tasted bitter. Margaret set her cup down carefully. "Clara. He mentioned she passed away." "Mentioned?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose like dark birds taking flight. "How generous of him. Did he mention how she died?" Thomas had said consumption, that terrible disease that took so many. But something in Eleanor's tone made Margaret hesitate. "He said she was ill." "Ill?" This time Eleanor's laugh scraped like nails on slate. "Is that what he calls it now?" She leaned across the counter, close enough that Margaret could see the powder caked in her wrinkles. "Clara threw herself from Widow's Peak. Left a note saying she couldn't bear another day in that house." The store seemed to tilt. Margaret gripped the counter's edge. "That's not," he said. "Of course he did." Eleanor patted Margaret's hand with fingers cold as winter branches. "Thomas says many things. Did he tell you about the locked rooms on the 3rd floor? About why the servants won't go up there after dark?" Margaret pulled her hand away. She had noticed the 3rd floor, its windows dark even when the rest of the house blazed with light. Every old house has unused rooms. Unused? Eleanor's smile widened, showing too many teeth. Those rooms were Clara's. He locked them the day after she died. Keeps the key on that chain he wears, right next to his pocket watch. She tilted her head, studying Margaret like a cat watching a mouse. "Haven't you wondered why a man with a dozen servants answers his own mail? Why he writes his own letters instead of having his secretary do it?" The letters. Margaret thought of the careful handwriting, the personal details no servant would know. She'd thought it showed sincerity. Now doubt crept in like frost forming on glass. "He wanted privacy," Margaret said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Privacy to trap another desperate soul." Eleanor moved around the counter, her skirts whispering secrets. "You're what, the 4th? 5th? They come from back east, full of hope, then disappear like smoke." Disappear? Margaret's throat felt dry despite the tea. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, he doesn't kill them, at least I don't think so. But they leave. Always at night, always alone. He gives them money, of course. Thomas is nothing if not generous with his guilt payments." A customer entered, breaking the spell. Eleanor's demeanor changed instantly, becoming the cheerful shopkeeper greeting a regular. Margaret used the distraction to slip outside, her head spinning worse than after her first train ride. The street looked different now. The Mackenzie Bank seemed to loom larger, its windows like empty eyes. The railroad office appeared more prison than business, its telegraph wires stretching like spider webs across the sky. "Miss Sullivan," a boy's voice called out. Jimmy, the freckled son of Thomas's foreman, waved from across the street. "Mr. Mackenzie sent me to find you. Says lunch is ready." Margaret forced a smile. "Thank you, Jimmy. I'll be right there." The boy scampered off, leaving Margaret alone with her doubts. She walked slowly toward the mansion, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house rose before her like a beautiful trap, its windows reflecting the pale winter sun. Mrs. Henderson met her at the door, her usual warm smile in place. "There you are, miss. Mr. Thomas was worried you'd gotten lost." "Not lost," Margaret murmured. "Just learning my way around." Lunch waited in the small dining room, the one Thomas preferred for everyday meals. He stood when she entered, concern creasing his forehead. "You're pale. Is everything all right?" Margaret studied him as if seeing him for the first time. The kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. The patient way he explained the town's history. The gentle manner with his servants. Could this man really hide such darkness? "I met Eleanor Hartley," she said, watching his face carefully. Something flickered in his eyes. Pain? Anger? Before his expression smoothed. "Ah, she told me about Clara." Thomas set down his napkin with deliberate care. "What exactly did she tell you?" "That Clara killed herself. That she jumped from Widow's Peak because she couldn't bear living here anymore." Silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice low and tired. "Eleanor believes what she needs to believe." "What does that mean?" He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the garden. Snow had covered the rose bushes, turning them into white ghosts. "Clara was troubled long before she came here. Her family hid it well. The mood swings, the wild accusations, the days she wouldn't leave her room." Margaret remained silent, waiting. "I tried to help her," Thomas continued. "Brought in doctors from San Francisco, specialists from Chicago. Nothing worked. She became convinced I was poisoning her food, that the servants were spying on her." He turned back to Margaret, looking older than his years. "The night she died, she'd been calm for weeks. I hoped." "The locked rooms?" Margaret asked softly. "I couldn't bear to change anything. Her books, her clothes, her paintings. They're all still there." He touched the chain at his vest. "I keep the key to remind myself that sometimes love isn't enough." Margaret rose and moved closer to him. This near, she could see the silver threads in his hair, the deep lines around his mouth. "Why didn't you tell Eleanor the truth?" "Because she needs someone to blame, and I have broad shoulders." Thomas smiled sadly. "Besides, what good would it do? Clara is gone. Eleanor's anger keeps her sister's memory alive, even if it's twisted. But she's spreading lies about you. Let her." He reached out, then let his hand fall. "The truth has a way of surviving, Margaret. Like those roses out there. Buried under snow now, but come spring, they'll bloom again." A discreet cough announced Mrs. Henderson's presence. "Begging your pardon, sir, but the mining supervisors are here for the weekly meeting." Thomas nodded. "I'll be right there." He turned to Margaret. "We'll finish this conversation at dinner. There's more you should know." After he left, Margaret wandered the house with new eyes. She noticed things she'd missed before. The piano in the music room, covered but dust-free, as if waiting for someone to play it again. The bookshelves with gaps where volumes had been removed. The portraits in the gallery, including one of a young woman with Eleanor's sharp features but gentler eyes. Clara. In the library, Margaret found what she hadn't realized she was looking for. A newspaper from 3 years ago. The headline read, "Tragedy at Widow's Peak." But it was the subheading that caught her eye. "Mrs. Mackenzie's death ruled accidental." "Accidental? You won't find the truth in there," Mrs. Henderson said from the doorway. She carried a tea tray, her sturdy shoes silent on the thick carpet. "Newspaper folk write what sells papers, not what happened." Margaret folded the paper carefully. What did happen? The housekeeper set down the tray and poured 2 cups with practiced movements. I was here that night. Heard the whole thing. She settled into a chair, looking older than her years. Miss Clara had been doing better, talking about spring planting, ordering new dresses from San Francisco. Then she got a letter. From who? Her sister. Mrs. Henderson's mouth tightened. Full of poison it was, telling Clara that Mr. Thomas was planning to have her committed, that he'd found someone younger, prettier. She shook her head. All lies, but Miss Clara couldn't see that. So she ran out into the storm. Mr. Thomas went after her, but the rain made the paths slick. By the time he reached Widow's Peak, the housekeeper dabbed her eyes with her apron. He blamed himself. Still does. Margaret sipped her tea, tasting truth bitter as medicine. Why would Eleanor do that to her own sister? Money, Mrs. Henderson said simply. Miss Eleanor had debts, gambling mostly. She'd been asking Miss Clara for money, and Mr. Thomas had put his foot down. No more handouts, he said. The housekeeper's voice dropped. Some folks can't stand seeing others happy when they're miserable themselves. That evening, dinner felt different. Margaret watched Thomas across the table, seeing not the Copper King or the mysterious millionaire, but a man who'd lost someone he tried to save. When he offered to show her Clara's rooms, she accepted. The 3rd floor smelled of lavender and dust. Thomas unlocked the door with the key from his chain, his hands steady but his eyes distant. Inside, twilight painted everything in shades of blue. The canopied bed, the writing desk, the easel by the window. She loved to paint, Thomas said, touching a canvas showing Silver Creek in spring. Not very well, but with enthusiasm. Margaret moved through the room like a ghost herself, careful not to disturb anything. On the desk lay a half-finished letter, the ink long dry. She didn't read it. Some privacies should remain intact. Eleanor said others came before me, she said quietly. Other women who left in the night. Thomas actually laughed, though it held no humor. There were 2 others after Clara. The first lasted a week before deciding Montana was too rough for her tastes. The second, he shrugged. She preferred my bank account to my company. I gave her what she wanted and sent her on her way. And me? Margaret faced him in the fading light. What do you see when you look at me? Someone who asks about libraries before ballrooms, he said softly. Someone who notices servants' names and thanks them. Someone who might see the man behind the money. Margaret thought of Eleanor's cold fingers, her calculated cruelty. Then she looked at Thomas's hands, scarred from work, gentle with grief. The choice, she realized, wasn't about wealth or poverty, truth or lies. It was about which story she chose to believe, the one whispered by bitterness or the one written in sacrifice. Show me more, she said, taking his arm. Show me the real Silver Creek. Not the buildings you own or the mines you run, but the town you helped build. As they descended the stairs, leaving Clara's rooms to their memories, Margaret felt something shift inside her. Eleanor had tried to plant seeds of doubt, but sometimes the richest soil grows from the darkest places. And sometimes, she was learning, the most valuable treasures aren't locked in vaults but in rooms we're brave enough to open. Tomorrow, she would write Eleanor a letter of her own. But tonight, she would listen to Thomas's stories of Silver Creek. The real stories, built from sweat and dreams rather than suspicion and spite. The truth, as Thomas had said, had a way of surviving. Like roses under snow waiting for spring. A floorboard creaked like a gunshot in the silent house. Margaret froze, her heart pounding so loud she feared it would wake the servants 3 floors down. Why was she sneaking around like a thief in the middle of the night? Because Eleanor's words about Clara's death had planted seeds of doubt that grew into thorny vines around her thoughts. Thunder boomed outside, making her jump. The storm had rolled in just after dinner, bringing winds that howled like lost souls. Perfect weather for uncovering dark secrets, she thought grimly. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 2 as she reached Thomas's study door. It stood slightly open, unusual for a man who locked everything. The room smelled of leather, brandy, and something else. Secrets, perhaps. Thomas's glass sat on the desk, amber liquid still swirling as if he'd just set it down. But where was he? Margaret's bare feet made no sound on the thick carpet as she approached the desk. The locked drawer seemed to call to her, promising answers to questions she wasn't sure she wanted to ask. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Curiosity killed the cat, Maggie. But another voice, stronger now, whispered. Satisfaction brought it back. The hairpin felt clumsy in her trembling fingers. Margaret had never picked a lock before, but desperation made her bold. The mechanism clicked, loud as a rifle shot in the quiet room. She held her breath, waiting for footsteps, for discovery. Nothing came but another roll of thunder. The drawer slid open with a whisper. No bloody knife, no poison bottle, no confession of murder lay within. Instead, she found a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon. The top envelope bore Clara's name in flowing script, but the postmark date made Margaret's blood run cold. 3 months after Clara's supposed death. My dearest sister Eleanor, Margaret read by flickering candlelight. I write to you from San Francisco, where Thomas's kindness has given me a second chance at life. The shame of what I've done, stealing from the railroad to pay your debts, weighs heavily upon me. Thomas could have sent me to prison. Instead, he gave me money and a new name. Please forgive me for the pain I've caused. Interesting reading? The voice came from directly behind her. Margaret spun so fast she knocked over the candle. Darkness swallowed the room except for lightning flashes that painted Thomas's face in stark relief. He didn't look angry, worse, he looked disappointed. I had to know, she stammered, letters spilling from her shaking hands. Thomas bent to retrieve them, his movements slow and deliberate. You could have asked. Would you have told me the truth? A sad smile touched his lips. The truth? That I let everyone believe Clara died rather than face scandal? That I've been sending money to San Francisco every month to support a woman who betrayed me? He struck a match, relighting her candle. Yes, Margaret. I would have told you. She slumped into the leather chair, overwhelmed. Eleanor said you killed her sister. Eleanor believes what she needs to believe. Thomas settled on the edge of his desk, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair. Clara was drowning in debts, Eleanor's gambling debts. She took money from the railroad's payroll. When I discovered it, she begged me not to prosecute. So you helped her escape? I gave her a choice, prison or exile. His voice held no bitterness, only weariness. She chose San Francisco and a new identity. I told everyone she died of consumption to protect her reputation, and Eleanor's. Margaret's mind reeled. But why? After what they did to you? Thomas reached for the fallen portrait on his desk. Not Clara's image, but a faded photograph of a young couple in simple clothes. My parents came to America with nothing but hope. They died in a mining accident when I was 16, leaving me alone in a country that saw me as just another Irish immigrant. His thumb traced their faces. I know what it means to need a second chance. You're nothing like what Eleanor said, Margaret whispered. People see what they want to see. He set down the photograph. Eleanor sees a villain because it's easier than facing her own guilt. The town sees the Copper King because wealth is simpler to understand than complexity. His eyes met hers. What do you see, Margaret? Lightning illuminated the room again, and in that flash, she saw everything. The boy who'd lost his parents, the man who'd built an empire from grief, the heart that still knew how to forgive. I see someone who deserves better than a wife who sneaks around in the dark. Thomas's hand covered hers on the desk. Then perhaps we both deserve better than the lies between us. The storm raged outside, but inside the study, something shifted. Margaret felt the walls she'd built around her heart begin to crack. She'd come searching for a monster and found something far more dangerous. A good man. Tell me everything, she said. From the beginning. Thomas poured 2 glasses of brandy, handed her one, and began to speak. He told her about arriving in Montana with nothing but determination, about the silver strike that changed his fortune, about Clara's beauty that had blinded him to her character. He spoke of loneliness that money couldn't cure and dreams that had nothing to do with copper or railroads. As dawn approached, painting the sky pink beyond the study windows, Margaret understood why Thomas had lied in his advertisement. He hadn't been seeking a wife. He'd been seeking someone who could see past the Copper King to the man beneath. "I should have been honest from the start," he admitted as birds began their morning songs. "We've both been hiding," Margaret replied, thinking of her own secrets, the real reason she'd fled Boston, the debts that had driven her west. "Perhaps it's time we stopped." Thomas raised his glass. "To new beginnings? To truth," she countered, clinking her glass against his. The brandy burned her throat, but it was nothing compared to the fire of revelation burning in her chest. She'd come to Silver Creek as a mail-order bride, expecting servitude. Instead, she'd found something far more precious, a partner in truth. As servants began stirring in the house above, Margaret made a decision. No more locked drawers, no more midnight investigations. If she was going to stay, and she realized now that she wanted to, it would be as Thomas's equal, not his suspicious bride. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, ready to share her own truth about the debts and dangers she'd left behind in Boston. Thomas listened without judgment, and as the sun rose over Silver Creek, two people who'd started with lies finally found their way to honesty. The explosion shattered Christmas Eve like a mirror dropped from heaven. One moment, Margaret was watching Thomas hand out bonus pay to his miners, their children singing carols in the crisp mountain air. The next, the earth itself seemed to scream. The blast wave knocked Margaret backward into a snowbank. Her ears rang as she struggled to her feet. The peaceful scene transformed into chaos. Black smoke poured from the mine entrance like dragon's breath. Women shrieked names of husbands and sons. Children stood frozen, clutching Christmas oranges that suddenly seemed obscene in their cheerfulness. "Cave in!" The cry spread like wildfire. 12 men trapped. Thomas was already running toward the mine, tearing off his fine wool coat as he went. Margaret had never seen him move so fast. Gone was the careful businessman. In his place stood someone wild and desperate. "Get back!" the foreman shouted at Thomas. "The whole thing could come down." "Those are my men in there," Thomas growled, shoving past him. Margaret pushed through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd seen Thomas angry, sad, thoughtful, but never like this. His face was set like granite, his expensive clothes forgotten as he grabbed a shovel. "Form a line," he commanded, his voice carrying over the panic. "We need timber for supports. You get the doctor. You bring water and bandages." The miners hesitated. Here was their boss, the richest man in Montana, ready to dig with his bare hands. Then Big Jim Sullivan, no relation to Margaret, stepped forward. "You heard Mr. Mackenzie. Move." What followed was the longest afternoon of Margaret's life. She found herself organizing the women, setting up a makeshift medical station, keeping children occupied and away from danger. All the while, her eyes kept returning to the mine entrance where Thomas worked alongside his men, their class differences erased by shared desperation. "The support beam's failing," someone screamed around sunset. Margaret's blood turned to ice as she saw Thomas disappear into the smoking tunnel. The crowd fell silent, even the children sensing something terrible was about to happen. Minutes crawled by like hours. The mountain groaned, showering rocks from above. Then movement at the entrance. First came 2 miners, supporting a third between them. Then another pair. But where was Thomas? Just as Margaret's hope began to fade, a figure emerged from the darkness. Thomas, his face black with soot, carried young Billy Harper on his back. The 8-year-old had snuck into the mine to surprise his father with a Christmas present, a wooden whistle he'd carved himself. The crowd erupted in cheers as the last trapped miners stumbled into daylight. Wives fell upon husbands, mothers clutched sons. But Margaret saw only Thomas, who had collapsed to his knees in the snow, coughing black phlegm. She was at his side in an instant. "You fool," she whispered, tears cutting clean tracks down her dusty cheeks. "You beautiful, reckless fool." His laugh turned into another coughing fit. Had to save them. You could have died. They're my responsibility. His eyes met hers, red-rimmed but fierce. Their families trust me. In that moment, Margaret understood something profound. She'd been wrong about Thomas, they'd all been wrong. He wasn't the Copper King ruling from on high. He was one of them, had always been one of them, just wearing finer clothes. Dr. Morrison pushed through the crowd. Let me see those hands, Thomas. Even in the failing light, Margaret could see the damage. Thomas's palms were shredded from clawing at rock, his knuckles split and bleeding. These weren't the soft hands of a gentleman, but the scarred hands of someone who'd never forgotten what real work felt like. Inside, Margaret ordered, supporting Thomas as he swayed. Now, the mansion felt different that night. Word of Thomas's heroism spread faster than wildfire. Miners' wives appeared at the back door with soup and bread. Children left small gifts on the porch, a pretty stone, a hand-drawn picture, that carved whistle from Billy Harper. Margaret cleaned Thomas's wounds by firelight in his study, the same room where she'd discovered his secrets just last night. How much had changed in 24 hours? Hold still, she murmured, dabbing whiskey on a particularly nasty cut. He hissed through his teeth. That burns worse than the rockfall. Baby. But her touch was gentle as she wrapped clean bandages around his palms. Why did you go in there? You have foreman for this. Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, when I was 16, my parents died in a mine collapse. No one went in after them. The owners said it was too dangerous, not worth risking more lives for immigrant workers. Margaret's hands stilled. I found their bodies 3 days later, when the dust settled. His voice was steady, but she saw the tremor in his jaw. I swore then that if I ever owned a mine, no family would go through that. No wife would wonder if her husband suffered. No child would grow up with that question mark hanging over their head. She resumed her work, blinking back tears. I was going to leave after Christmas, she admitted. I know. How? I saw you counting your money yesterday, checking train schedules. He caught her hand, careful of his bandages. I wouldn't have stopped you. And now I can't imagine leaving. The words surprised her even as she spoke them. When I saw you go into that mine, I realized something. What's that? I've been as guilty as Eleanor, as Clara, as all the others. I saw your money first, your power. I missed the man who reads poetry at midnight, who knows every worker's name, who risks his life for people society says don't matter. Thomas pulled her close, his soot-stained shirt leaving marks on her dress. Neither cared. Stay, he whispered into her hair. Not because I'm rich or powerful, but because you're you, she finished. The real you, the one I was too blind to see. The grandfather clock struck midnight, ushering in Christmas Day. Outside, snow began falling, each flake catching moonlight like tiny stars. The miners' children started singing again, their voices carrying on the cold air. Margaret looked at Thomas's bandaged hands, at the gray in his hair, at the lines worry and weather had carved into his face. She saw not the Copper King of Montana, but Thomas Mackenzie, immigrant's son, self-made man, protector of those who had no one else. Merry Christmas, she whispered, kissing his forehead. Best one yet, he replied, pulling her closer. In the distance, church bells began to ring, calling Silver Creek to Christmas service. But Margaret and Thomas stayed by the fire, two people who'd found something more precious than silver or gold. They'd found truth, trust, and the beginnings of real love. Tomorrow would bring questions, challenges, and Eleanor's inevitable return. But tonight, in the warm circle of firelight, with the scent of pine and the sound of carols drifting through the windows, they had everything they needed. The rescue would become legend in Silver Creek, the day the Copper King proved he was really one of them. But for Margaret, it would always be something more. The day she stopped looking for an escape and started building a home. As the fire burned low and Thomas dozed in his chair, exhausted from his heroics, Margaret made a silent promise. No more doubts, no more investigations, no more looking for reasons to leave. She would stand beside this complicated, courageous man, not as a mail-order bride, but as a true partner. The snow continued to fall, blanketing Silver Creek in white, covering the scars of the mine explosion, offering the gift of new beginnings. And in Thomas Mackenzie's study, two hearts that had started with deception finally found their way to truth. The door exploded inward, slamming against the wall with enough force to shatter the crystal vase on the entry table. Eleanor Hartley stood framed in the doorway, her usually perfect hair wild, her eyes blazing with something between grief and madness. "You've killed her!" she screamed, waving a crumpled telegram like a weapon. "Clara's dead. Really dead this time, and it's your fault." Margaret stepped between Eleanor and Thomas, her heart racing but her voice steady. In the week since Christmas, since the mine rescue, something fundamental had shifted inside her. She wasn't the frightened girl from Boston anymore. "Calm yourself, Mrs. Hartley," Margaret said, surprised by her own authority. "You're making a scene." Eleanor's laugh bordered on hysteria. "A scene? My sister threw herself into San Francisco Bay because this man," she jabbed a finger at Thomas, "abandoned her to shame and poverty." Thomas moved to speak, but Margaret held up her hand. No, this was her battle now. "Your sister," Margaret said carefully, "embezzled money from the railroad to pay your gambling debts. Thomas gave her a second chance instead of sending her to prison. If that's abandonment, then perhaps we need a new dictionary." The telegram fluttered from Eleanor's fingers as her face went pale. How do you know about that?" "Because unlike you, I asked for the truth instead of inventing my own." Margaret bent to retrieve the telegram, scanning its contents. Her stomach clenched. Clara was indeed dead, but not from suicide. Pneumonia, the telegram said. A common killer in the damp San Francisco winter. "She died of pneumonia, Eleanor," Margaret said softly. "Not despair." Eleanor swayed, grasping the doorframe for support. But I told everyone Thomas drove her to suicide. I've been saying it for months." "Yes," Thomas spoke for the first time, his voice gentle despite everything. "You needed someone to blame. I understand." "You understand?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "After everything I've done, all the lies I've spread about you?" Margaret watched Thomas cross the room, watched him take Eleanor's trembling hands in his still bandaged ones. "Grief makes us do terrible things," he said. "I know that better than most." The scene that followed would stay with Margaret forever. Eleanor collapsed, months of lies and anger dissolving into raw grief. Thomas guided her to a chair, called for tea, treated her with the same compassion he'd shown Clara. "Why?" Eleanor whispered when she could speak again. "Why be kind to me now?" "Because," Margaret answered, understanding flooding through her. "That's who he is. That's who he's always been." Later, after Eleanor had gone, humbled but not broken, Margaret found Thomas in his study, staring into the fire. "You let her destroy your reputation," she said, settling beside him. "Let the whole town think you drove Clara to suicide. Reputations can be rebuilt." He took her hand. "Eleanor needed her anger more than I needed my good name." Margaret shook her head in wonder. "When I first came here, I thought being rich meant having power over others. But your wealth isn't in your bank, Thomas. It's in your heart." Speaking of hearts, he reached into his pocket, producing 2 rings. One was an enormous diamond that caught the firelight like captured stars. The other was a simple gold band, worn smooth with age. "This," he said, holding up the diamond, "is what the Copper King would give his bride. But this," he lifted the gold band, "belonged to my grandmother. She wore it for 50 years, through famine in Ireland, through the voyage to America, through everything that came after." Margaret's throat tightened. "It's beautiful." "Margaret Sullivan, I'm asking you to marry me. Not as the mail-order bride I deceived, not as someone seeking escape, but as my partner, my equal, my love." She touched the simple gold band. "No more lies. No more lies. Although," he hesitated, "there is one more thing I haven't told you." Margaret's heart stuttered. "What?" "I hate pickled herring. Absolutely despise it. But you seemed so proud of your mother's recipe last week. I ate 3 pieces. Her laughter echoed through the study. Thomas Mackenzie, are you telling me the great Copper King was defeated by a fish? By a woman's smile, he corrected, slipping the gold band onto her finger. Will you marry me, Margaret? Will you help me build something better than copper mines and railroads? Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. The kiss that followed tasted of promises and new beginnings. Outside, Silver Creek prepared for New Year's celebrations, unaware that in the Mackenzie mansion, 2 hearts were already celebrating their own renewal. But their moment was interrupted by pounding at the door. Thomas frowned. Now what? Margaret followed him to the entry hall, where Sheriff Watson stood, hat in hand, snow dusting his shoulders. Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Mackenzie, but there's trouble at the Henderson place. Banks trying to foreclose. Jim Henderson's locked himself inside with a shotgun. Says he won't let them take his family's home. Thomas was already reaching for his coat. On New Year's Eve, those vultures have no shame. Thomas. Margaret touched his arm. Let me come with you. He hesitated, then nodded. Partners. Partners. The scene at the Henderson farm was tense. Bankers huddled in the snow, sheriff's deputies fingered their weapons, and from inside came the sound of children crying. Jim Henderson's voice carried through the windows. I've got nothing left to lose. Jim, Thomas called out. It's Thomas Mackenzie. Let me help. Help? Came the bitter reply. Like you helped Clara? Everyone knows what you did. Margaret stepped forward before Thomas could respond. Mr. Henderson, I'm Margaret Sullivan. I'm going to be Mrs. Mackenzie soon, and I'd like to tell you what really happened with Clara. Silence from the house. Taking that as permission, Margaret raised her voice so everyone could hear. Bankers, deputies, the gathering crowd of townspeople. She told them everything. Clara's theft, Thomas's mercy, the truth about her departure to San Francisco. The man you think you know, she concluded, isn't real. The real Thomas Mackenzie saved 12 miners last week with his bare hands. The real Thomas Mackenzie forgave people who betrayed him. And right now, the real Thomas Mackenzie wants to help you keep your home. The door creaked open. Jim Henderson emerged, shotgun lowered. That true, Mr. Mackenzie? About Clara? Every word, Thomas confirmed. Now, about this foreclosure. What followed was a masterclass in negotiation. Thomas bought the Henderson debt on the spot, restructuring it into payments the family could manage. But he didn't stop there. Gentlemen, he addressed the bankers. I'm establishing a new policy. Any family facing foreclosure can apply for assistance through the Mackenzie Foundation. We'll review each case, provide legal help, restructure loans where possible. You can't save everyone, one banker protested. No, Thomas agreed. But I can try. As they rode home through the snowy streets, church bells began tolling midnight. New Year's Day, 1886, had arrived. You were magnificent, Thomas told Margaret. The way you stood up to Eleanor, the way you spoke to the crowd. I learned from watching you, she replied, though I still have questions. Such as, the Mackenzie Foundation? When did you establish that? His grin was boyish. About 30 seconds before I announced it. Partners. Partners, she laughed. Though perhaps we should discuss major financial decisions in the future? Absolutely. Right after we plan the wedding. The mansion glowed with light as they approached, and Margaret saw figures moving inside. Her heart sank. More emergencies? But when they entered, they found the house full of people. Miners and their families, shopkeepers, ranchers, even Eleanor Hartley, arranging flowers with trembling hands. Surprise! The shout nearly lifted the roof. Big Jim Sullivan stepped forward. We heard there's to be a wedding. Figured we'd start the celebration early. But how did you know? Margaret asked, bewildered. Mrs. Murphy from the boarding house winked. In a town this size, news travels faster than those fancy telegraphs. What followed was the most unusual New Year's party Silver Creek had ever seen. The Copper King's mansion, usually so formal, rang with laughter and music. Children slid down the grand banister while their parents pretended not to notice. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon couples were dancing in the ballroom. Margaret found herself whirled from partner to partner. Miners with coal-stained hands, ranchers smelling of leather and sage, young Billie Harper standing on her feet to reach proper dancing height. "You've changed everything," Eleanor said when they found themselves alone by the punch bowl. "I came here tonight to apologize, but watching you, I think I came to learn." "Learn what?" "How to see people as they really are, not as my prejudices paint them." Eleanor's smile was fragile but genuine. Could you teach me?" Before Margaret could respond, Thomas appeared, slightly disheveled from dancing with miners' wives. "Eleanor, I have a proposition. The Mackenzie Foundation will need someone to oversee its operations. Someone who understands desperation, who's made mistakes and learned from them." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You're offering me a job? After everything?" "I'm offering you a purpose," Thomas corrected. "What you do with it is up to you." As Eleanor struggled with tears, Margaret squeezed Thomas's hand. This was what she loved most about him, his ability to see potential where others saw only problems. The party continued until dawn, when the revelers finally departed, leaving the mansion strewn with evidence of joy. Margaret and Thomas stood on the front porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. "Quite a way to begin the year," Thomas murmured, pulling her close. "Quite a way to begin a life," she corrected. "Though I have one request." "Anything? No more pickled herring at the wedding?" His laughter echoed across the valley, rich and free. And in that moment, Margaret knew she'd found something rarer than gold, more precious than copper. She'd found home. "Stop the wedding!" The shout echoed through Silver Creek's small church like a gunshot. Every head turned as a stranger burst through the doors, mud-spattered and wild-eyed. Margaret's blood ran cold as she recognized him. Detective Pinkerton from Boston, the man hired by her creditors to hunt her down. The church erupted in whispers. Margaret stood frozen at the altar, her mother's wedding dress suddenly feeling like a shroud. She'd never told Thomas about the debts that drove her west, the forged signatures, the desperate choices that could land her in prison. "Margaret Sullivan," Pinkerton announced, striding down the aisle. "You're wanted in Boston for fraud, forgery, and theft. I'm here to take you back." Thomas stepped protectively in front of her, but Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "No more lies," she whispered. Then louder, "It's true." Gasps filled the church. Even Thomas looked stunned. "When my parents died," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "they left nothing but debts. The landlord was going to throw me out. I forged my father's signature on loan documents, took money I couldn't repay. I fled west because prison seemed worse than becoming a mail-order bride." Pinkerton produced handcuffs. "Then you'll come quietly?" "She's not going anywhere," Thomas declared. "How much does she owe?" "With interest, $3,000. The amount drew whistles from the crowd, a fortune to most people in that church. Thomas reached for his checkbook, but Margaret stopped him. "No," she said firmly. "I won't start our marriage with you buying my freedom." She faced Pinkerton. "I'll go with you. I'll face what I've done." "Like hell you will," came a voice from the back. Big Jim Sullivan stood up, his mining helmet still dusty from the morning shift. "Mr. Pinkerton, how much is that reward you're getting for bringing her in?" Pinkerton shifted uncomfortably. $500. "And the rest goes to the creditors who hired you?" "That's right." Jim looked around the church. "Well then, folks, seems to me we've got a community matter here. This woman helped save our children during the mine collapse. She stood up to the bankers trying to foreclose on the Henderson place. She brought truth to this town when we were all believing lies." Mrs. Murphy from the boarding house stood next. "I've got $50 in the collection plate." "And I've got 30, called out Doc Morrison. One by one, the townspeople rose. Miners, shopkeepers, ranchers. People who had nothing in common except their respect for the woman who'd shown them Thomas's true character. Even Eleanor Hartley, sitting in the back row, opened her purse. Within 20 minutes, they'd raised $2,000. The church had become something more than a wedding venue. It had become a courtroom where a community rendered its verdict. Thomas added the final $1,000, but not as charity. Consider it her first month's salary as director of the Mackenzie Foundation, he announced. A position she's more than earned. Pinkerton looked at the pile of money, then at the determined faces surrounding him. This is highly irregular. So is love, Margaret replied. So is forgiveness. So is community. The detective counted the money twice, signed a receipt, and handed it over. The debt is paid in full. But Mrs. Mackenzie, you should know that running from problems rarely solves them. I'm not running anymore, Margaret said, taking Thomas's hand. I'm building. As Pinkerton left, Reverend Mills cleared his throat. Well, now that's settled. Shall we proceed with the wedding? Laughter replaced tension as everyone returned to their seats. But the ceremony that followed was different from the one they'd planned. It wasn't just a union of two people anymore. It was a community celebrating its own power to transform lives. Do you, Margaret Sullivan, take this man? Reverend Mills began. I do, she interrupted, earning chuckles. Sorry, Reverend. I've waited long enough. Thomas slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger. With this ring, I thee wed, and with my worldly goods. We'll share them, Margaret finished, and put them to good use. Their kiss was interrupted by cheers that rattled the church windows. As they walked back down the aisle, Margaret noticed details she'd been too nervous to see before. Miners still wearing their work clothes, children fidgeting in hand-me-down Sunday best, women who'd walked miles from outlying ranches. These were her people now, her family. The wedding reception filled the mansion's ballroom, but it was unlike any society event Silver Creek had seen. Instead of a string quartet, they had fiddles and harmonicas. Instead of champagne, they had homebrewed beer and apple cider. Children raced through the halls while their parents pretended not to notice. Not quite what you expected when you advertised for a bride? Margaret teased as they shared their first dance. Better, Thomas replied, spinning her around. I advertised for a wife and got a partner, a teacher, a conscience. And I answered an ad for escape and found a purpose. She gestured to the crowd. Look at them, Thomas. 6 months ago, half these people thought you were a monster. Now they'd fight for you. They fought for you today, he corrected. You showed them who I really am. But more importantly, you showed them who they could be. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself pulled aside by Eleanor, who looked transformed in a simple gray dress instead of her usual black. I have something for you, Eleanor said, producing Margaret's mother's cameo. I couldn't sell it. Every time I tried, I heard your voice talking about recognizing true worth. Margaret closed Eleanor's fingers around the brooch. Keep it. Let it remind you that change is possible. I don't deserve. None of us deserve grace, Margaret interrupted. That's what makes it precious. The party continued until sunset, when Thomas and Margaret finally escaped to the library. Through the windows, they could see lanterns bobbing as guests made their way home, their laughter carrying on the evening air. We should start the foundation's work tomorrow, Margaret said, already planning. The Henderson situation showed us how many families are struggling. Already thinking about work on your wedding night? Thomas teased. I'm thinking about our real fortune, she replied. Not the copper or the railroad, but the chance to make a difference. Thomas pulled her close. When I wrote that advertisement, I was trying to trick someone into seeing past my wealth. Instead, I found someone who showed me what wealth really means. A knock interrupted them. Young Billy Harper stood in the doorway, clutching something behind his back. Sorry to bother you, Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, but I made something. He produced a wooden carving, 2 figures standing hand in hand. It's you two. I used the wood from the mine supports you helped put up after the collapse. Margaret knelt to his level. It's beautiful, Billy. Thank you. Pa says you're going to help folks like us keep our homes. Is that true? Yes. Thomas answered. Your pa's going to help us figure out how to do it right. After Billy left, Margaret studied the carving. The figures were rough but unmistakable, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other smaller but standing equally strong. He sees us as equals, she murmured. That little boy sees what others missed. Children often see clearest, Thomas agreed. They haven't learned to be blinded by society's expectations. As night fell over Silver Creek, Margaret stood at the window, watching stars emerge above the mountains. The woman who'd boarded a train in Boston, desperate, deceived, and running from her past, was gone. In her place stood Margaret Mackenzie, partner in the territory's most powerful enterprise, director of a foundation that would change countless lives, and wife to a man whose true wealth lay in his heart. Regrets? Thomas asked, joining her at the window. Only that I didn't see the truth sooner. She turned to face him. I came here expecting servitude and found service. Expected deception and found depth. Expected to be owned and learned to be an owner, not of things but of purpose. The railroad whistle sounded in the distance, the same whistle that had announced her arrival months ago. But now it didn't sound like escape or endings. It sounded like connection, possibility, and beginnings. Shall we? Thomas gestured toward the stairs. One moment. Margaret moved to his desk, where the original advertisement lay preserved under glass. Taking up a pen, she wrote across the bottom, "Position filled beyond all expectations." As they climbed the stairs together, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd answered an ad seeking a transaction and discovered a transformation. The mail-order bride had become a full partner, the desperate woman had become a community leader, and the Copper King had revealed his heart of gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, managing the foundation, navigating society's expectations, building a marriage based on truth rather than pretense. But tonight, as moonlight silvered the mountains and Silver Creek settled into sleep, Margaret Sullivan Mackenzie knew she'd found her true fortune. Not in copper or silver, but in the courage to see beyond appearances to the genuine gold within. In the quiet of their room, as Thomas extinguished the lamp, Margaret touched the simple gold band on her finger and smiled. Sometimes the greatest wealth comes disguised as desperate choices. Sometimes running away leads you exactly where you need to be. And sometimes, a lie in a newspaper advertisement becomes the truest story ever told.